This is Quarter Notes, the quarter annual music recap show. To kick off this section, we're going to talk about all of the popular drama this quarter. Let's start off with the single J Christ by Lil Nas X. This was a rather short-lived controversy surrounding the depiction of Lil Nas X up on the crucifix for his music video J Christ. I can understand why people got upset at this, especially religious people, but ultimately as a popular artist, it seemed like Lil Nas X was just trying to get the most engagement for this music as possible. And by pulling just a little bit of controversy, he seemed to get just the right amount of buzz for this track. Musically, I think it's fine, there's nothing super special about it, but in terms of the marketing, I have to say it was one of the better performed rage bait rollouts I've seen, because he seemingly buried it pretty soon after. Alright, let's get to it. This is a situation that has been rapidly heating up over April and May as I've been scripting this video. So for now I just want to take it piece by piece and cover all the developments I was aware of by just the end of March this year. So that being said, a lot of things that have happened are not going to be talked about in this video. I'm keeping tabs as the story develops, so be sure to check back in August or September for a full breakdown of next quarter's developments. For now, let's just get into the details. On October 6th of 2023, Drake released his most recent album For All the Dogs, including a track featuring J. Cole entitled First Person Shooter. On the second verse of this track, J. Cole raps this line where he applies to be a member of the top 3 rappers alive today, alongside Drake and Kendrick Lamar. Additionally of note, later in the song, Drake compares himself to Michael Jackson in terms of sales numbers for his albums. J. Cole's remark was relatively harmless and simply demonstrated a sense of unity in hip-hop today, with an attempt to see the top rapper conversation as a harmless side note to the actual music they create. However, many believe this line conflicts with the historically competitive nature of hip-hop music, where it has always mattered to the audience who is really on the top of the game. One of these people happens to be Kendrick Lamar, who hopped on the track Like That from Future and Metro Boomin's collaborative album We Don't Trust You to respond to these claims made by Cole. Kendrick didn't hold back, essentially calling out the duo for getting too soft, claiming he's not up for any Big Three discussion and that he stands alone on the top. He also throws out the bar Prince outlived Mike Jack, taking a jab at Drake's claim of popularity and implying that Kendrick makes music at a higher artistic caliber. The verse is densely packed with references to his opponents, as well as hip-hop history as a whole, and Kendrick's delivery and ad-libs show a ton of fire in his lungs. Suffice it to say, he didn't hold back and the hip-hop world stood silent for a minute, as we waited for the shockwaves of this verse to ripple out. There were a variety of responses through social media from Drake, but preferring we just stick to the music, the most notable development after this was 2 weeks later, when J. Cole surprised us with his mixtape Might Delete Later. In the grand scheme of things, the lyrical content of the disses J. Cole responded to Kendrick with on this album are not entirely relevant given what took place afterwards, but to summarize, J. Cole made surface-level digs at Kendrick's music, seemingly disinterested in doing so as he does it. He essentially praises Good Kid Mad City and Damn as important releases, and has to admit how much people love To Pimp a Butterfly even if he found it boring. The only real criticism he seems to have at Kendrick is sparking this beef in the first place, which only became clearer about a week later when he walked on stage at his Cole World Festival to publicly retract this statement, squashing the beef by proclaiming his love and respect for Kendrick's music. Given how this situation has escalated, this might have been a good move for Cole, ducking out before it got too crazy. But he probably should have figured this out a bit sooner before releasing this whole mixtape, which could have saved him a bit of embarrassment. I understand there were many voices in his ear, however, so no real judgment there. By the end of March, we were hearing some foreshadowing anger from Drake on Twitter and other social media platforms, but that's where we have to leave off for the end of March, so be sure to check up next time for the next further developments. This next beef was only the center of cultural attention for about a week, but it was still a rather interesting piece of celebrity drama. On January 26, 2024, Megan Thee Stallion put out her single Hiss, coming at the throats of her haters and detractors with confident, braggadocious bars and directed callouts towards those who profit off of hating her. Overall, I think the track stays pretty neutral in the way it attempts to put down her detractors. However, one bar commenting on the casual acceptance of child sexual predators in the industry struck a chord with one Nicki Minaj. Nicki Minaj has relationships with known convicted sex offenders, including her husband and her brother, so whether or not this bar was intentionally directed at her, it incited an absolute spiral from her on Twitter, where she was non-stop posting her opinions towards Megan's single throughout the following night. This ultimately culminated in a musical response from Nicki Minaj through the release of her single Bigfoot. Unfortunately, this was pretty much universally panned on arrival by anyone outside of the hardcore Barb sphere. I don't hate the general sound and flow of this track, but as it continues to go on, Nikki just sounds more and more unhinged and bothered, trailing off in the end into this unhinged rant with literally no backing instrumentation. Not to get too far ahead of myself quarter-wise, but this track has a lot in common with Drake's last response in his beef with Kendrick. They're both accusing their opponents of what they've been accused of, the beats are equally uninteresting, and they both sound so upset and bothered, clashing with their claims of standing victorious. Either way, it was an interesting little spat between a pillar of the industry and a hungry up-and-comer, so like most beefs, the real winners in this case were the music fans. I have never been much of a 21 Pilots fan, but as far as I understand, there's been an underlying story developing throughout the music they've been making up to this point that the fan community has spent time piecing together over the past decade or so. Then, it seemed like out of the blue, the boys came out with this video in conjunction with the announcement of their comeback album Clancy that pretty much spelt out every aspect of the lore, clearing up all the mysteries there within. Personally, I don't necessarily think this is the worst thing, catching people up to past albums, characters, and concepts before going into the new release and clarifying where the fanbase has gone wrong so far as a sort of lore checkpoint, but I do understand the emotions as a fan of something you've been heavily invested in finding answers for just being suddenly unveiled. Either way, I thought it was a funny little development, and it has me excited for whatever they're trying to do next with this upcoming project. This next bit of drama was fortunately very short-lived, but when Beyonce released the 2 singles for her new album Cowboy Carter, those being Texas Hold'em and 16 Carriages, there were a couple smaller radio stations, particularly KYKC 100.1 in Oklahoma, that didn't play the singles despite their popularity. This created a bit of buzz on social media, and people began to tweet at the station's account en masse, causing them to not only add the song into their rotation, but actually release a tweet saying that they were going to add these songs, calming people's worries. It's debatable whether the song wasn't on the radio station in the first place due to something like racism, like much of Twitter seemed to believe, or due to them being a smaller station who struggled to get the rights to play these songs in a timely manner. There was also an early email response from this station saying they don't play Beyonce because they're a country station and she's not a country artist. But the way I see it, this could have easily been sent from somebody who simply wasn't aware yet of Beyonce's recent genre switch. Is this radio station racist? Maybe, and shame on them if they are. But as far as what they've actually done, it seems like there was simply a bit of confusion that got worked out pretty swiftly. Either way, the story was widely talked about alongside another outrage that her singles may not be placed onto the Billboard charts for top country songs when they dropped. However, that never really ended up happening despite how many TikToks were talking about it. Ultimately, I speculate this outrage was some sort of marketing move on Beyonce's team to strike up conversation about the new album. I talk about it more in my top of the queue, but Beyonce had to play a lot of strategic moves to justify the rollout of this album, with a complete switch up in identity from what much of the public had known her for up to that point. So I wouldn't put it past her marketing team to see an opportunity to capitalize on outrage to promote this album. As far as I can tell, this is just a good example of social media picking up a tabloid rambling from old news media and passing it off as fact. And this whole situation has made me a bit more aware of what I accept as truth from my phone, both on social media and from news headlines. For the remainder of this video, we're going to talk about some albums that were pretty popular this quarter, but I thought were just kind of mid. Let's talk about this album Saviors by Green Day. This wasn't anything crazy or mind-blowing, but it was a decent return to form for the band. It was definitely good to see them make a decent comeback after their last album God of All Motherfuckers, but the songwriting ultimately isn't up to par with the material from their prime and comes off a bit cornier now that the guys are getting up there in age. I would definitely recommend listening to this one if you've ever been into one of Green Day's projects before. It's sort of a touchstone of all their work that they've done up to this point and an attempt to bring things all back around. So I feel like there's a track or two for most people, even if a majority of it is just sort of meh. This album, Jesse Volume 4 by Jacob Collier, has been rather divisive lately, and although I think most of the hate it's getting is unjust and from a crowd of people who write off anything they consider theatercore, there is a ton of talent poured into this album. Many performances are lively, well recorded, and well produced, being spaciously mixed and incorporating new elements naturally. I don't even hate some of the zanier ideas Jacob is going for it, like his little metalcore breakdown at the end of the opening track 100,000 Voices, or his whole Box of Stars stadium tour concept near the end. I haven't listened to a full Jacob Collier album before, and I really tried to go into this project with an open mind. From the beginning, it wasn't too bad, and I actually enjoyed the risks it was taking and the sounds it was going for. It sort of feels like a big party of musicians that Jacob is both learning from and trying to elevate the sound of in his own work, with features galore from some huge names in music. The whole vibe is pretty appealing at first, if not a little airbrush sounding production-wise from all of the big pop influence. But by the time we get to the last bit of the album, I just find the constant sense of huge scale and importance really grating. It sort of feels like I'm listening to this album with Jacob, and every 30 seconds he turns to me and gives me this ear-to-ear grin like I'm supposed to be floored by this new crazy thing he just did. Yes, it's impressive what he can do musically, and I don't necessarily find any of the music cringe just for existing, but when this cover of Bridge Over Troubled Water by Simon & Garfunkel came on, and the vocal performance sounded like someone milking their limelight out of the national anthem at a football game, I had to drop the score by a few notches. It was the Garfunkel that broke the camel's back, and from that point I couldn't really meet this album halfway anymore. Genuinely give this one a try before you judge it, but beware, it can come across a bit pretentious and is overall a very different style of creative expression than most musical projects. Next up, let's talk about All Is Yellow by Lyrical Lemonade. This album got a fair shake of attention during its rollout, but quickly fizzled as there wasn't much to show outside of the already released singles. There's heaps of notable talent throughout this record, but as a project, it feels like much of the talent, both vocally and on the production side, was just haphazardly arranged. They pair together artists whose flow and delivery don't work great together, on beats that lack punch or sound generic or washed out. This record, however, is fortunate enough to feature Doomsday Part 1 and 2, which act as dueling interpolations of the same bass sample. The first part, featuring the late Juice WRLD alongside Corday, is the best track here, with clear, crisp production and some real vocal chemistry between the two performers. And the second is a fairly good verse from Eminem, which is unfortunately pretty rare to hear these days, so it's nice to have. Aside from that, there really isn't much here. The song Hello There is a pretty embarrassing interpolation of Blink-182's I Miss You, but aside from that, this was a fairly boring listening experience that I wish I didn't have to dive into multiple times for this review. Anyways, check this one out if you want to, I don't really care. This new album by Kali Uchis is an album I'm very hesitant to call undeserving of its praise and popularity, because from a completely objective perspective, it's well made, it's really danceable, and the vocal performance throughout is solid. But as a non-Spanish speaker, it just didn't have a diverse enough sound palette to really keep my attention throughout. I understand why much of the tracks need to have the same sort of cadence in the drum and bass, in order to be accessible to the clubbing or partying audience. But speaking strictly from my perspective as someone listening to this album at my desk by myself, it's difficult to dig into much of the detail without any of the lyrical context. This is an album with a ton of merit, but unfortunately it just isn't my thing. However, I do just want to shout out the last track on this project, which I enjoyed for its traditional Mexican pop sound and the tempo switch up halfway through. The drums and bass are bouncy and inviting, and there's this accordion just going ham behind Kali's vocals till the end. I didn't love the rest of this album, but the closer is straight up fire. Seriously though, definitely don't take my word on it for this one. Go listen to it for yourself, because I am no authority to criticize music I don't even speak the language of. I was planning to be pretty mean when talking about Eternal Sunshine by Ariana Grande, but when I listened to it back for this review, this album had grown on me significantly just by listening to it in a much more casual environment. It doesn't really have the same punch as some of her prior work, and I don't think it's anything super special or boundary pushing, but it's mostly inoffensive as long as you don't read too deep into the way she's trying to portray her life and the way that differs from her actual life, or at least the life that the public eye understands her to live. There's still a lot of interesting hooks and melodies here, even if the lyrics feel a little bit written by committee. The only other really annoying thing about this release was the way that she kept putting out Yes and as a single over and over again in different ways. I understand it's kind of the way that streaming works now, but I just got really tired of that song. If you're into Ariana Grande, you're probably going to like this album, but that being said, if you're not into Ariana Grande, it's probably not going to sell you on her. Alright, and with that, that's all of Quarter Notes for January through March of 2024. I ended up covering over 60 different musical projects or events that happened over this period, so if you ended up missing any of those videos before this one, be sure to check those out. Otherwise, if you like this content, consider subscribing, and I'll see you for Quarter 2 in the next edition of Quarter Notes.